My name is Silas Croft, and for the last 49 years, I've lived a lie. It was a lie that kept something sacred alive, and a truth about humanity buried so deep I thought it could never be found. I hid a living Bigfoot creature on my family's timber property, right here on the border of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. I'm telling you this now, breaking nearly 5 decades of silence, because they finally found us. They're coming for me as I record this. But the story is all I have left to give. It's the only thing that matters anymore. You have to believe me. You have to understand why I did it, what I protected, and what was lost when the world finally broke down my door. This isn't just a monster story. This is a confession. And by the end, you'll know exactly what they took from me, and what this creature tried to give back. It's a truth I think you deserve to hear, before they erase it completely. Along with me, the helicopters are getting closer. I don't have much time, so please, just listen. If you're wondering why you should believe a single word from an old man telling a ghost story from the woods, I understand. My credibility isn't in my words. It's in this place. It's in the 80 acres of old-growth Douglas fir that my family has owned since my grandfather's time. It's in the constant, damp chill of Western Washington that seeps into your bones and never truly leaves, a permanent resident in your joints. My proof is in the specific high-pitched groan of my old Willys Jeep's winch, a sound I know better than my own heartbeat after all these years of hauling wood and clearing deadfall. It's in the lonely, mournful sound of the wind as it whistles through the rusted frame of the decommissioned fire lookout tower I've called home since I was a young man. I'm a fixture here, as much a part of the landscape as the oldest cedar. People in the nearby town of Randall, they know me. They know me as the quiet hermit on the hill, the man who never leaves. They have no idea why I stay. They think I'm just strange. They don't know I'm a warden. I've been a prisoner of this mountain since 1974. That was the year my world fractured. The year my younger brother, Leo, vanished into these same woods. He was a pilot, just 22 years old, full of that reckless light that young men have. He was always chasing the horizon, convinced something better was just over the next ridge. His little Cessna 150 went down somewhere in this unforgiving tangle of green and gray rock. They searched for weeks. The Civil Air Patrol flew grid patterns until the fuel costs became too much. The rangers and volunteers on foot combed the terrain until the first heavy snows made it impossible. They found nothing. No wreckage, no emergency signal, no scrap of metal, no body. He was just gone, swallowed whole by the forest. Guilt is a heavy coat, and I have worn it every single day since he disappeared. I was supposed to be with him on that flight. I backed out at the last minute, and so I stayed here, a self-imposed exile, punishing myself by listening to the crushing silence he left behind. That silence held for years, a long, unbroken note of grief that became the soundtrack to my life. Then, one October night, it broke. It wasn't a roar, not the kind of cheap, theatrical sound you'd expect from a monster movie. It was something far more real and far more chilling because of it. A sharp, metallic snap that echoed up from the deep ravine below my cabin. It was an ugly final sound, the sound of a poacher's trap. A big one, probably a bear trap, left to rust and wait. I know the sound. I've found their cruel handiwork before, dismantled them whenever I could. But this time was different. The snap was followed by something else, a low, pained breathing. A sound of immense, foundational suffering that seemed to vibrate right up through the floorboards of my tower, through the soles of my worn-out boots. It felt like the mountain itself was in agony, and I was the only one who heard its cry. It was a sound that demanded a witness. And then, an even stranger thing happened, something that chilled me more than the sound of the trap itself. The forest went dead quiet, an unnatural quiet. The night here, in this forest, it's never truly silent. There are always the rhythmic chirps of crickets, the distant, questioning hoot of a barred owl, the rustle of a raccoon or a deer in the undergrowth. It's a living, breathing symphony of small noises. But after that sound, after that pained breathing began, there was nothing, a total, suffocating absence of noise. It was as if every living thing in a 1-mile radius had gone still, holding its breath, listening, waiting. The woods hold their secrets tight, and in that moment, I felt like I was standing right on the edge of the biggest one of all. That sudden, profound silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was full of fear. And it was a clear and potent warning to whatever was listening. Stay away. My hand went to the shortwave radio on the desk. The dusty bakelite knob cool beneath my trembling fingers. The procedure is clear, drilled into you by the Forest Service pamphlets they leave at the general store. You hear something like that? A possible trapped animal, a sign of poachers. You call the rangers at the Cowlitz Valley Station. It's their land, their jurisdiction. It's the safe thing to do, the responsible thing. I could have just keyed the mic, reported an injured bear, and they would have sent a team out at first light. My part in it would be over. No risk, no involvement, no questions asked. But I couldn't stop thinking about Leo. I thought about him being lost out here, maybe injured, waiting for a rescue that never came. I thought about that sound of breathing, the sheer, ragged agony in it, and a cold certainty settled in my gut. This wasn't a bear. This was something else. This was the secret the forest had been keeping all along. I didn't make the call. Instead, I stood up and broke a solemn promise I'd made to myself the year after Leo disappeared. A promise to never, ever go off trail after dark. The woods are a different animal at night. The paths you know like the back of your hand in the daytime. They twist and vanish. Distances become meaningless. Every shadow looks like a hole in the world, and every sound is a threat. But I couldn't just sit there and listen to it die. I grabbed my big, heavy maglite from its hook by the door, and I took my late father's old bolt-action .30-06 rifle from the rack above the doorframe. Not because I intended to shoot anything, but because its familiar weight in my hands, the worn smoothness of the wooden stock, was a small comfort against the cold fear that was coiling in my stomach. I stepped off my porch, into the damp, foggy darkness, and I walked towards the sound. My boots sunk into the soft earth, and I was committed. The air grew colder, heavier, as I descended into the ravine. The beam from my lantern cut a shaky, nervous tunnel through the oppressive darkness and the thick, swirling fog that clung to the ferns. Every snapped twig under my boot sounded like a gunshot in the dead air. My heart was a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, a desperate rhythm against the unnatural, listening silence of the woods. My breath plumed in front of me, a temporary ghost in the flashlight's beam. I kept the light low, sweeping it back and forth across the forest floor. And then I saw it, the source of the breathing. It was a juvenile. I realize that now, looking back. But at the time, it was just immense. A dark, powerful shape hunched against a fallen log, its form breaking the familiar patterns of the woods. One of its legs was caught, horribly, sickeningly mangled in the rusty teeth of that trap. The steel jaws were buried deep in its calf, and the forest floor around it was dark with blood. It wasn't thrashing or roaring like a panicked animal would. It was just enduring. Its broad shoulders, covered in dark, matted hair, heaved with each ragged, painful breath. It turned its head as my light finally found it, and for a long second, we were locked in that beam of light together. The eyes, they didn't glow red or yellow like in the campfire stories. They were just dark and deep, and they were filled with a kind of weary, intelligent pain that I recognized in the mirror every morning. I saw fear there, yes, but it was underneath a profound awareness. It watched me, but it didn't make a threatening move. It didn't bare its teeth. It just watched. All the stories, all the grainy photos and wild claims, they were all cheap, flimsy caricatures. This was a living, breathing being in agony, and it was looking right at me, this small, old man with a light and a useless rifle. The forest was holding its breath, and so was I. He knew what I was. He was waiting to see what I would do. I could have run. God knows, every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn and scramble back up that ravine and bolt the door. I could have fired the rifle into the air, hoping the noise would scare it off. Maybe make it tear itself free in a blind panic. I could have done 100 stupid, fearful things. But instead, my mind flashed to an image of Leo, alone in his cockpit in the final moments, lost and afraid out here in this same wilderness. I thought of what it would be like to die in a cage of steel, cold and alone and in pain. I looked back at the creature, at the resigned intelligence in its eyes. Slowly, deliberately, I unclipped my old metal canteen from my belt. I knelt down, opened my canvas pack, and pulled out the small first aid kit I always carry. just some gauze, antiseptic wipes, and medical tape. I didn't get any closer. I wouldn't dare. But I placed the canteen and the kit on a flat-topped stump about 20 feet away from it, right in the edge of the light circle, a peace offering. Then I backed away, step by agonizing step, my heart in my throat, never turning my back until I was out of the ravine and back on the path to my tower. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat by the window in my old armchair, the rifle across my lap, staring into a darkness that felt different now. It was no longer empty. It was inhabited. I was waiting for a roar, for the sound of snapping bone, for the flashing lights of rangers I never called. But there was nothing, just the silence slowly returning to normal. The crickets tentatively starting their song again around 3 in the morning, as if the danger had finally passed. The next morning, shaking with exhaustion and fear, I went back. I was terrified of what I might find, a body, or a blood trail leading to one. The trap was still there, sprung and empty, but it had been bent open, the thick steel jaws twisted apart by a raw, brute force I can't even comprehend. The canteen was on the ground, empty. The first aid kit was gone, and so was the creature. That was the moment I made my choice, the one that defined the rest of my life. I would tell no one. This secret was mine now, mine and the forest's. And that's how it all began. If you've made it this far, then a part of you wants to believe. A part of you knows there are things in this world that don't fit in neat little boxes. Please, stay with me. Like the post, subscribe, and share this with someone who will listen. What happened next? The pact we formed. It will change how you see the wilderness forever. You need to hear the rest of the story. That first week was a long, humming silence. Every creak of my tower, every gust of wind felt like a question I couldn't answer. Was it gone? Was it dead somewhere in the thickets? My meager offering unused. The suspense was a physical weight, a sickness in my gut that was horribly familiar, a ghost of the same waiting I did for news of Leo. I couldn't bear it. A full 7 days after I'd left the first aid kit, I went back, not to the ravine itself, but to a landmark I knew, a natural border, a colossal ancient cedar tree, easily 12 feet in diameter, struck by lightning a century ago and hollowed out by fire. It was a natural alcove, a dry, sheltered space on the edge of the deep woods. It felt like a threshold between my world and his. There, inside the hollow, I left a can of peaches, the good kind, in heavy syrup, and a block of salted venison jerky. I didn't know what else to do. It was a gesture, a question sent out into the silent woods. The next morning, I couldn't stop myself. I went back at dawn, the ground wet with dew, my heart hammering a nervous rhythm against my ribs. The forest was waking up, birds calling in the canopy, a squirrel chattering angrily from a high branch. Everything felt normal, which only made me more tense. As I approached the hollow cedar, I slowed my pace, scanning the ground for any sign, any disturbance. The air was still and cool. I peered into the dark opening of the tree. The can of peaches was gone. The jerky was gone. There was nothing left in their place. No tracks I could make out on the hard-packed earth and pine needles. Just an absence. But it was a meaningful absence. The question had been received. The offering had been accepted. A strange sense of relief washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning. A silent agreement had been struck in the heart of the woods. This was the birth of the ritual. The beginning of a new purpose that slowly, carefully, began to fill the cracks in my shattered life. I started making my supply run into Randall on Tuesdays, a fixed point in the lonely, drifting sea of my weeks. Tuesday became the day. It gave my week a structure, an anchor point beyond my own grief. I'd come back with my groceries, the old Jeep groaning up the logging road, and I'd set aside a portion of it, canned fruit, dried meat, sometimes a bag of nuts or a bar of baker's chocolate. It felt less like I was feeding a stray animal and more like I was paying a toll or leaving an offering at a wild, ancient altar. Every Tuesday, I would have this small pile of goods on my kitchen counter, a tangible piece of my connection to the secret out there in the woods. The silence of my life was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet anticipation of our next exchange. The rules of our pact were never spoken, but they were written in the language of instinct and observation, and I learned them quickly. The first rule became clear a few weeks in. He would not show himself in the light. One Tuesday, a storm was rolling in, and I got impatient. I wanted to make the drop before the rain started. I took the supplies down to the hollow cedar in the late afternoon, while the sun was still a pale, watery disk in the sky. I left the food and went back to my tower, watching from the window. Nothing. The rain came and went. The offering sat there all night. The next morning, it was still there, untouched, soaked with rain. The message was unmistakable. This was a transaction that belonged to the shadows, to the liminal space between dusk and dawn. Our world was a world of darkness and trust. Daylight was for my kind, for the loud, prying eyes of the world I was trying to keep at bay. The second rule was about boundaries, and I learned it the hard way. My curiosity was a gnawing thing, a constant itch under my skin. I wanted to see him again, just a glimpse. One evening, after leaving the supplies, I didn't retreat. Instead, I crossed the small, gurgling creek that ran along the bottom of the ravine, our unspoken property line. I took maybe 3 steps onto the other side, into his territory, moving slowly, holding my breath. The response was instantaneous and terrifying. A deep, resonant thump-thump echoed through the valley. It wasn't a sound made with a voice. It was the sound of a massive fist or a heavy log striking the trunk of a giant fir. The impact vibrated through the ground, up my legs, and into my chest. It wasn't an attack. It was a warning, a clear, definitive, and absolute statement. This far and no further. I scrambled back across the creek, my heart pounding. The message received. My place was on my side of the water. His was on his. The warning was a lesson, but it also led to a gift. I understood the no, but I needed a yes. I needed to know when it was safe to approach the cedar at all. The next Tuesday, I hesitated at the edge of the woods, unsure. The memory of that concussive thump was still fresh. I stood there for a long time as the twilight deepened, just listening, and then I heard it. It was faint at first, easy to mistake for the wind. A soft, 2-note whistle, a low note followed by a slightly higher one. It was a simple, melodic sound, like a strange, nocturnal flute. It wasn't a bird I recognized. It cut through the other noises of the forest with a gentle authority. It felt like an invitation, permission, the all-clear I had been waiting for. From that day on, I would always wait for the 2-note whistle before I made my way to the hollow tree. The thump meant danger. The whistle meant the way was clear. We had a language. And so, the ritual was perfected, a silent liturgy repeated every 7 days. On Tuesday evenings, I'd finish my chores, watch the sun dip behind the western ridges, and I would stand on my porch and just listen. Sooner or later, drifting up from the deep woods, the 2-note whistle would come. That was my signal. I'd grab the small canvas bag of supplies, my old flashlight, and I would walk the well-worn path down to the hollow cedar. The crunch of my boots on the gravel and pine needles was the only sound. I never dallied. I would place the offerings inside the dark. Chen chi chi dan undian fu. Dry hollow. The canned peaches. The jerky. Maybe a bag of apples or a loaf of day-old bread. I would turn and walk away, never looking back. The forest would watch me go. It was a trade. A trade is a trade. It was a promise I made and a promise I kept. Week after week, year after year. It was the most important job I've ever had. My most sacred duty. Slowly, my offerings began to change. I started thinking beyond simple sustenance. As the first chill of autumn sharpened the air and the nights grew colder, I thought of him out there, exposed to the elements. I thought of that mangled leg and how the cold must ache in it. One Tuesday, along with the usual food, I left a thick suutax, heavy wool blanket I no longer used. It felt like a significant escalation, a move from sustenance to comfort, from transaction to care. When the relentless Pacific Northwest rains began in November, I left a folded EA, heavy-duty tarpaulin, the kind loggers use to cover their equipment. I was trying to say things without words. I'm thinking of you. I hope you are warm. I hope you are dry. I was no longer just appeasing a mystery. I was tending to it. I was trying to make amends for the cruelty of that rusty steel trap, for the cruelty of my own kind. The first time he gave something back, it wasn't a mystical sign. It was a simple, practical act of reciprocity that struck me dumb. I was out splitting firewood, my rhythm thrown off by a growing unease about an upcoming storm. In my haste, my favorite hand axe, The one with the hickory handle my father had shaped for me slipped from my belt and tumbled down a steep, mossy embankment near the creek. It was too wet and treacherous to retrieve it safely before dark. I cursed my carelessness and went back to the tower, resigning myself to losing it. The following Tuesday, I made my usual drop at the hollow cedar, and there, propped neatly against the outside of the trunk, shining in my flashlight beam, was my axe. It was clean, wiped free of mud. He had found it, understood it was mine, and returned it. He wasn't just taking. He was a participant in this exchange. He understood fairness. That single act opened a new chapter in our silent conversation. The gifts began to appear more regularly, left in the same spot where I'd found the axe. They were never things of monetary value, but they were rich with a meaning I had to decipher. One week, it was a cluster of quartz crystals, all milky white and catching the faint moonlight, arranged in a careful spiral. Another time, it was a collection of eagle feathers, the big primary feathers from a wing, laid out in a perfect fan. Once, I found a string of dried, vibrant red chanterelle mushrooms, a gourmet delicacy, draped over a low-hanging branch. He was showing me things he found beautiful, or rare, or useful. He was sharing his world, the treasures of the forest floor, a place I could no longer safely explore. It was his way of talking, of saying thank you, of showing me the world through his eyes. Each gift was a new word in our shared, silent vocabulary. The brutal effectiveness of his warning system was proven on a cold night in January. I'd heard the two-note whistle, the all clear, and was halfway down the path to the cedar tree when the signal changed abruptly. Thump, thump. The sound was sharp, urgent, and closer than before. It stopped me dead in my tracks. It wasn't a casual warning, it was an alarm. A clear and frantic, "Stay back, danger, now." I trusted it implicitly. I turned around without a second thought and retreated to the tower, bolting the door behind me. I spent the night watching and listening, my rifle in my hands. The next morning, I cautiously went to investigate. Near the ravine, not 50 yards from the hollow cedar, I found them. 2 sets of fresh boot prints, the deep waffle stomp of hunting boots, and on the ground, a pile of spent shotgun shells and a half-empty pack of cigarettes. Poachers. They had been there, right there, waiting. He hadn't been protecting himself. He had been protecting me. Over the years, the ritual became the rhythm of my life, but the grief for Leo never truly faded. It was a low, constant hum beneath the surface of everything. Near the cabin, there's a small, flat clearing that overlooks the valley where his plane was lost. I had rolled a single, large, moss-covered boulder to the center of it years ago. It wasn't a grave, just a memorial, a place to sit and talk to him, to tell him about my day, to confess my loneliness. I'd go there most evenings to watch the sunset, paint the sky, tracing the constellations as they appeared, wondering which one he was a part of now. I never imagined anyone was watching me, but he must have been. He must have seen me there, a lonely old man talking to a rock, night after night. He was observing my ritual, just as I was observing his. He was learning my language of grief. Winter was setting in hard that year, one of the coldest I'd seen in a decade. The snow was already deep, and the forecast promised a brutal cold snap. I knew the wool blanket wasn't enough. On my next trip to town, I spent more money than I should have on a high-tech thermal survival blanket, the kind that reflects body heat. It was silvery and thin, but incredibly effective. It felt like a foolish expense for a hermit like me, but I didn't care. That Tuesday, as I placed the neatly folded, crinkling silver blanket inside the hollow of the cedar, it felt different. It felt like I was crossing a threshold. This wasn't just a trade anymore. It wasn't about keeping a monster at bay. This was an act of profound, desperate care for the only other living soul who truly knew the secrets of this mountain. I was entrusting him with a piece of my own warmth, a piece of my own humanity. A week later, I made my usual pilgrimage to Leo's memorial stone. The air was frigid, the ground frozen solid, and I saw something on the boulder. I got closer, my breath catching in my throat, forming a thick cloud in the icy air. There, placed directly in the center of the great stone, was a small, perfectly woven circlet. A wreath. It was made from the dried, feathery stalks of fireweed. My legs felt weak. Fireweed. It was a simple, common plant, but it was Leo's favorite. He loved it because it was always the first sign of life after a forest fire. its brilliant pink flowers a defiant splash of color against the charred landscape. He called it the phoenix flower, a symbol of hope and rebirth. How? How could he possibly have known? It wasn't a guess, it was a message. He had watched me, he had listened, and he had understood. In that moment, he wasn't a creature or a monster or a secret. He was a mourner. He was grieving with me. A trade is a trade. And with that small, impossible ring of flowers, he had paid his debt in full. He had my loyalty forever. That small, woven ring of fireweed changed everything. The ritual continued. The Tuesday drops at the hollow cedar became as ingrained in me as breathing. But the feeling behind it was different. It was no longer a transaction born of fear and necessity. It had become a conversation. Our silent partnership, once based on a simple trade, now felt like a shared watch. We were the two keepers of this patch of woods, each guarding a different side of a boundary only we understood. I found myself talking to him more, not just at Leo's stone, but as I worked, murmuring updates about the weather or complaining about my aching back. The silence that answered me felt different now, not empty, but attentive, a companionable presence just beyond the tree line. He was my silent confidant, the only one who knew the whole truth of my life on that mountain. My grief was no longer a solitary burden. It was a story I was sharing with the forest itself. The bond was truly forged in the crucible of a particularly vicious winter. A blizzard rolled in from the north, burying my tower in 4 feet of snow, a heavy, wet cement that snapped branches and promised to linger for weeks. The temperature plummeted. I was completely cut off, the old Jeep useless in drifts higher than its hood. My stacked firewood dwindled faster than I'd anticipated. A deep, primal fear began to set in. The fear of freezing, of my own aging body failing me in the face of the cold. The path to my woodshed was a solid wall of snow. I was 70 years old, and for the first time, I felt the very real possibility that the mountain I had chosen as my refuge might become my tomb. The cold wasn't just outside. It was a weariness seeping deep into my bones. A surrender I had to fight with every shiver. The morning after the worst of the storm passed, I woke to a world of blinding white and absolute silence. As I looked out the window, my heart nearly stopped. The impossible had happened. A wide path had been cleared from my porch all the way to my woodshed, stamped down through the deep snow by feet so large they'd compacted the drift into a stable walkway. And there, next to the shed door, was a pile. A huge pile of dry deadwood, mostly pine and fir, all broken into manageable lengths, perfect for my stove. It was wood from the upper ridges, seasoned and dry, from places I couldn't have reached even without the snow. It wasn't just a gift, it was an act of profound understanding and effort. He had seen my struggle, understood my need, and provided not just food, but warmth. He had saved my life, and I never even had to ask. That act of deliberate, intelligent care moved me to change my side of the trade once more. Sustenance was no longer enough. I felt an overwhelming urge to understand the mind behind those dark, knowing eyes. So, I started leaving things of curiosity in the hollow cedar alongside the food. I left an old, hand-cranked music box that played a tinny, simple melody. A week later, I left a set of my childhood wooden building blocks, their paint faded and corners worn smooth. On another Tuesday, I dared to leave a small, polished hand mirror, wondering what he would make of his own reflection. It was a new kind of question. Not, "Are you hungry?" but, "What do you think?" I was no longer just feeding a creature. I was trying to communicate with a mind, to bridge the immense gulf between our species with these simple, human objects, hoping for a sign of recognition. The responses were subtle, but they spoke volumes. The music box was returned to the base of the tree a week later, its crank fully unwound, the music silent. He had figured it out, listened to it until it stopped, and then given it back. The wooden blocks weren't there the next day, but a month later I found them, down by the creek, stacked into a bizarre, impossible tower that defied gravity, a piece of alien architecture on a mossy stone. The hand mirror was never seen again. I imagined him looking into it, seeing his own face for the first time, and I wondered if he felt recognition or just confusion. These small interactions were everything to me. They were proof of a curious, reasoning mind. A trade is a trade, but our currency was no longer just peaches and jerky. It was ideas. We were trading pieces of our separate worlds, and the mystery of who he was only deepened. The outside world finally broke our peace, not with a gunshot, but with the steady, droning hum of heavy machinery. The vast 800-acre plot of timberland adjacent to mine, a silent green buffer that had protected my solitude for decades, was sold. The buyer was some tech millionaire from Seattle who wanted a wilderness getaway. His idea of a cabin was a monstrous palace of glass and steel that went up with shocking speed. The construction noise was a constant intrusion, a mechanical grinding that drowned out the sound of the wind in the firs. The forest's quiet rhythm, the one I had lived by for nearly 40 years, was fractured. That deep, abiding peace I had found here was being systematically dismantled by bulldozers and nail guns. The world I had worked so hard to keep at bay was now my next-door neighbor. The first casualty was the soundscape. The weekends became a nightmare of noise pollution. The high-pitched metnefortifatic wikimiti insind angry whine of ATVs tearing up delicate moss beds and scaring the wildlife echoed through the valley. At night, the distant but insistent thump of electronic music from their parties pulsed through my floorboards, a profane heartbeat against the forest's sacred silence. Laughter, loud and careless, from people who saw the woods as a playground, not a sanctuary. For the first time since Leo's disappearance, I felt truly exposed. The two-note whistle, our signal of safety, fell silent. I couldn't risk it, not with new ears listening. The ritual became a thing of pure risk and instinct. The woods felt tense, coiled, holding its breath against this new, noisy invasion. He knew they were there. The deep, warning thumps against the trees became more frequent. And then, the inevitable happened. The millionaire's weekend guests, flush with expensive gear and a surplus of boredom, started to venture further. They were hikers of the worst kind, loud, entitled, and utterly oblivious. One afternoon, a group of them went off trail, following a game path that led them dangerously close to the ravine, to his territory. They found it, a single, perfect 18-inch footprint, pressed deep into the soft mud by the creek bed. Of course, they took a picture. Of course, they posted it online. "Is this the Gifford Pinchot giant?" the caption read, full of smug, unearned discovery. My blood ran cold. The secret was out. Not the whole truth, but a crack had appeared in the dam I had so carefully built, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that the flood was coming. The digital world had found us. That single photo brought the first wave. Not serious researchers or government agencies, but something almost worse. The hobbyists, the weekend warriors of the cryptozoology world. They descended on the public trails bordering my land, armed with brand new camouflage gear, night vision goggles, and a profound lack of respect. They set up motion-activated trail cameras on trees, their little red lights blinking in the darkness like malevolent eyes. The forest, my sanctuary, started to feel like a prison yard. The paranoia was a constant companion, a bitter taste in the back of my throat. Every snapped twig was a potential intruder, every distant flicker of light a new camera I had to find and disable. Our world was shrinking, being encircled by a web of cheap technology and loud, clumsy curiosity. My life became a frantic, desperate game of counterintelligence. I was no longer just a caretaker, I was a saboteur. I spent my days stalking the woods, finding their trail cams and smearing the lenses with mud and pitch. I'd create false trails, using an old deer hoof to stamp tracks that led them in circles, deep into the swampy, mosquito-infested lowlands miles away from the ravine. It was an exhausting, thankless job. I was an old man, my bones aching, playing spy games against men half my age. I felt myself getting slower, getting tired. The ritual became fraught with tension. The two-note whistle was a distant memory. Now, I only moved in the deepest dark, my senses on high alert. The warning thumps from the ravine became more frequent, sharper, carrying a new edge of agitation and stress. He felt the cage closing in, just as I did. Then came the sound that marked the beginning of the end. It was a quiet, still Tuesday afternoon, the air thick with the smell of pine after a light rain, and I heard it, a sound that did not belong, a high-pitched electric whine, like a giant, metallic insect. It grew closer, an invasive noise that cut through the natural peace of the forest. A drone. You can't hear a drone until it's too late. It was a mechanical eye in the sky, a prying, soulless violation of everything we had built. It passed directly over my tower, a silver speck against the gray sky, and made a beeline straight for the ravine, straight for him. There was nowhere to hide from a sky that had eyes. I felt a surge of helpless fury. They had crossed the final boundary. They had invaded his home. Before I could even think of a plan, a roar erupted from the deep woods. This was not the measured, deliberate thump-thump of a warning. This was not the gentle, questioning whistle. This was a sound of pure, unrestrained, primal fury. A deep, guttural roar so powerful it seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain, making the glass in my windows rattle and the floorboards vibrate under my feet. It was a sound of profound rage and terror, the desperate cry of a cornered, intelligent being that had finally been pushed past its limit. It was the most terrible sound I had ever heard, because I knew it was not a threat. It was a confession. With that single, desperate roar, he had just announced his existence to the entire, listening world. He had just turned a local legend into a verifiable target. Panic gave my old body a surge of adrenaline I hadn't felt in years. I didn't think, I just acted. I grabbed my father's .30-06 from its rack, scrambled out onto the porch, and fired 2 shots straight up into the air. The crack of the rifle echoed across the valley. Then I started screaming, a wild, theatrical performance of pure terror. "Bear! Big one! It's a rogue!" I yelled, my voice hoarse. "It's charging the cabin!" I waved my arms like a madman, making myself the biggest, most interesting target in the area. I had to draw that prying, mechanical eye away from the ravine. I had to pull the focus, the danger, onto myself. The lie felt like ash and bile in my mouth, a betrayal of the quiet truth of the woods. But it was the only weapon I had. I was sacrificing my own credibility to save his life. It worked. The drone's whine changed pitch as it banked sharply in the air. It abandoned its course over the ravine and zipped back towards my clearing, hovering like a hawk for a moment before retreating towards the millionaire's lodge. The furious roaring from the forest stopped. But the silence that fell in its place was not one of relief. It was heavy, thick with consequence. Less than an hour later, I heard the familiar rumble of an engine. The Green Forest Service truck of Ranger Evans was bumping its way up my private road. Evans was a good man, someone I'd known for 2 decades, shared coffee with in town, and I had to stand there, my hands still trembling, and look him straight in the eye while I sold him a flimsy, pathetic story about a phantom bear. The near disaster was averted, but the cost was a piece of my soul. I had lied to a friend, and the doubt in his eyes told me I was on the map now. I was no longer just the quiet hermit. I was a person of interest. The weeks following my lie to Ranger Evans were the loneliest of my life. A new kind of quiet settled over the forest, an unnerving, watchful silence that was different from the one he and I had once shared. It was a silence born of mistrust. I'd see Evans's truck parked at the edge of the public access road sometimes, just watching my tower through binoculars. The bloggers and hobbyists had thankfully moved on, bored by the official story of a spooked bear, but their digital scent lingered. The ritual, our Sacred Tuesday trade, was broken. I left supplies, but the 2-note whistle never came. The food would be gone in the morning, a ghost of our former pact. But the warmth, the connection, was gone. The woods felt hollow, and so did I. I was a man on an island, surrounded by a sea of my own making, and the tide was rising. You can't lie to the forest, and you can't lie to a good man, not without paying a price. I was paying it in solitude. My days became a blur of anxious routine. My senses stretched thin, listening for the whine of a drone or the crunch of boots that didn't belong. The paranoia was a physical thing, a constant tightness in my chest. I spent more time maintaining the fences on my property line, a futile attempt to reinforce a boundary that had already been breached. My world had shrunk to the physical labor of my hands, the familiar weight of a tool, the predictable complaint of an aging muscle. The joy was gone. The sense of shared purpose had evaporated, replaced by a grim, lonely duty. I wasn't a warden anymore. I was just a jailer. And I wasn't sure if I was keeping the world out or just locking myself in. The warning thumps from the ravine had stopped. The roar had stopped. There was nothing. And that nothing was the most terrifying sound of all. It was the sound of a friend who had been betrayed and gone silent. The turning point didn't come with a roar or a gunshot. It came with a quiet, sickening failure of my own body. It was 5 years ago, a crisp autumn afternoon. I was out mending a stretch of barbed wire fence on the south slope, the one that overlooks the steepest drop into the valley. I was pulling the wire taut with a stretcher tool when the pain hit. It wasn't sharp, not like a cut, but a deep, crushing weight that started in the center of my chest and radiated out, a suffocating pressure that stole my breath. My left arm went numb, a useless dead weight. The fence stretcher clattered to the ground. The world tilted, the brilliant blue sky and the dark green of the firs spinning into a dizzying vortex. My knees buckled. I remember the smell of the damp earth as it rushed up to meet me, the prickly sensation of pine needles against my cheek, and a single, overwhelming thought: I have failed him. Then, nothing. I woke up to a different kind of pain, a dull, aching throb in my chest, a skull-splitting headache, and a profound sense of disorientation. I wasn't on the south slope. The ground beneath me wasn't the soft, damp earth of the forest floor. It was the hard, familiar groan of the wooden planks of my own porch. I was propped up against my front door, my legs sprawled out in front of me. It was dusk. The sky was a bruise of purple and orange. How did I get here? The last thing I remembered was falling, a good half-mile away. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to rise in my throat, but I was too weak. I could barely lift my head. The world felt muffled, distant, as if I were listening to it from underwater. And then I felt it more than saw it, a presence, something big, standing just at the tree line, where the woods met my small clearing, a colossal shadow in the dying light. He was there, a dark, mountainous silhouette against the darkening sky, utterly still. He was just watching me, waiting. The fear I should have felt was absent, replaced by a wave of exhaustion and a strange, bone-deep sense of gratitude. I tried to speak, to say something, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. And then he made a noise. It wasn't a roar or a thump. It was a sound I had never heard before, and one I will never forget. A soft, guttural whimper that seemed to emanate from deep within his chest. It was a low, resonant sound, full of a kind of pained, confused emotion I can only describe as concern. It was the sound a loyal dog makes when its master is hurt. It was the sound of a being trying to comprehend a fragility it did not possess. In that moment, the immense gulf between our species, between man and monster, vanished. There was only a shared, silent understanding of my mortality. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, my own weak breathing a counterpoint to the quiet vigil of the giant in the trees. He had saved me. He had found me, broken and unconscious on the forest floor, and had somehow dragged me, a 180-pound dead weight, all the way back to the safety of my own door. It was an act of strength that defied belief, but it was the gentleness of it that shattered me. I wasn't torn or bruised from being dragged. I had been carried or pulled, with a care that spoke of something far beyond animal instinct. He had protected me. The one I had spent decades hiding, the one I thought I was protecting, had just returned the favor in the most profound way possible. A trade is a trade, but this was a debt I could never repay. He had given me back my life, and I didn't even know how to say thank you. As my eyes slowly adjusted to the twilight, I saw it. There, on the porch railing right next to my hand, was a small, dark object. It hadn't been there before. I reached out a trembling hand, my fingers fumbling as they closed around it. It was cold, metallic, and familiar. It was Leo's old compass. The brass was green with age. The glass cracked, and there was a deep, distinct dent on one side from a fall he'd taken years before the final one. It was the one he'd had clipped to his flight jacket on his last flight, the one I had searched for, wept for years. It was impossible. He had found it. Somewhere out there in the vast green wilderness that had swallowed the wreckage, he had found this single, tiny piece of my brother, and he had kept it. For how long? Decades. He had kept it, and now, in my moment of greatest weakness, he had returned it to me. He wasn't looking at me anymore. The colossal shadow at the edge of the woods had turned his head, his gaze directed not at my broken form, but out, across the valley, out towards the horizon where the first stars were beginning to appear in the purple sky. He was looking out for me, not at me, and in that gesture, returning my brother's compass while I was near death, I understood. It wasn't just a trinket he'd found, it was a message. It was his way of saying he knew. He knew the source of my grief, the reason for my lonely vigil at that memorial stone. He was connecting my collapse to the original wound that had defined my life. He was returning a piece of my lost brother to me, a gesture of profound empathy that transcended species, language, and time. He was trying to heal me in the only way he knew how. In the weeks that followed, as I slowly recovered, I started paying closer attention to the strange symbols I'd occasionally find scratched into rock faces or smooth-barked trees near the ravine. I had always dismissed them as territorial markings, a kind of primitive graffiti. But after he returned the compass, I looked at them with new eyes. They weren't random. There was a complex geometry to them, a deliberate pattern. He would use a sharp piece of quartz, its white dust still faintly visible in the grooves. The symbols weren't pictures of animals or trees. They looked like maps, but not maps of the forest. They looked like maps of the night sky. They resembled star charts, clusters of points and arcs that mirrored the constellations above us. This wasn't a beast marking its territory. This was an intelligence recording its location, or maybe its origin. The realization settled on me slowly, a dawning awareness that was both thrilling and terrifying. I spent my nights with Leo's old astronomy books, cross-referencing the patterns I'd sketched in my notebook with the charts of the heavens. And there it was. Every symbol he scratched was a variation of the same celestial map. It was a patch of sky in the constellation of Eridanus, a faint, unremarkable collection of distant stars. And in every single carving, one small group of stars in that constellation was circled, always the same one. A small, tight cluster, circled with a deep, deliberate groove. It was a destination, a point of origin, a home. The payoff wasn't just that he was intelligent. The payoff was that he was lost. Just like Leo, he wasn't from here, and he was trying to show me where he came from. He was trying to tell me his story. In that moment, everything I thought I knew was rewritten. I spent half my life hiding what I thought was a monster, a relic of our own world's prehistory, only to realize I was hiding a refugee, an exile, a silent astronomer, stranded a million light years from home, marking the path back on the rocks of his lonely prison. And he was grieving with me. He saw my loss, my pain over a brother lost to the sky, and he recognized it. Maybe it was a familiar pain. He wasn't just a creature, he was a person. A person I had formed the deepest bond of my life with, a bond of shared solitude and silent understanding. The secret I was keeping was so much bigger than a monster in the woods. It was the secret of a visitor. And protecting him was no longer about preserving a mystery. It was about protecting the last survivor of a catastrophe I couldn't even imagine. If this story has touched you, if you can feel the weight of that compass in your hand and see that lonely figure pointing to the stars, then please show your support. Like this recording, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone you know who listens to the silence. The world needs to know what it is about to lose. Stay with me, because what happens next, it's the reason they are coming for me now. The reason I may not see another sunrise. You have to hear how they found out. The federal government didn't come with sirens and flashing lights. They came with silence. A silence more profound and menacing than anything the forest had ever produced. It arrived in a plain, dark sedan that navigated my rutted-out road with unnerving efficiency. A woman knocked on my door. She was compact, with hair pulled back so tight it looked severe, and eyes that didn't seem to blink. She introduced herself as Agent Thorne, from the Department of the Interior. But it was the name of her division that froze the blood in my veins, the Office of Unconventional Asset Assessment. She wasn't a park ranger investigating a bear story. She wasn't a biologist chasing a wild myth. Her very presence, her calm, bureaucratic tone, told me this was a different kind of hunt. They weren't here for a monster, they were here for property. And in that moment, I knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in my gut, that the thing I had protected for so long had a new, terrible name: Asset. Thorne was maddeningly polite, which only made her more terrifying. She explained, in a voice devoid of emotion, that my property had been flagged, not because of footprints or local gossip. That was amateur hour. It had been flagged by an automated threat detection algorithm used by the Department of Defense. The drone audio, the one the tech millionaire's guests had captured, contained more than just a roar. It contained a distinct infrasound signature, a low-frequency vibration that their satellites had also picked up. cross-referencing it with anomalous energy readings that had pulsed from this valley for decades. They hadn't stumbled upon him because of a lucky photo. They had been drawn here by a digital trail of breadcrumbs he never knew he was leaving. My primitive attempts at counter-surveillance, smearing mud on trail cams, were a child's game against an opponent who watched from orbit. They didn't have to see him. They could hear the very air around him vibrate. The conversation on my porch was a masterclass in psychological pressure. Thorne never accused me of anything. She spoke in hypotheticals, her eyes scanning the tree line behind me. An ecological anomaly of this significance, she said, her voice a low hum, cannot be left to chance. It's a matter of national heritage, Mr. Croft. A living piece of history. She used words like preservation and study, but her eyes were cold and acquisitive. I saw it then. They didn't want to understand him. They wanted to possess him. He wasn't a creature to them. He was a specimen, a data point, a biological treasure to be cataloged, dissected, and stored in a concrete room somewhere, far from the whisper of the wind in the firs. She left her card, a sterile white rectangle with an embossed seal. We'll be in the area, conducting our survey. We'd appreciate your cooperation. It wasn't a request. It was a declaration that my land was no longer my own. The siege began that night, a siege of silence and light. From my tower, I could see them. Faint, intermittent glints of red and green light deep within the woods, on the ridges surrounding my property. The telltale signature of night vision and thermal optics. They were creating a perimeter, a cage of invisible electronic eyes. My old shortwave radio, once a comfort, became a source of terror. The usual static was now peppered with short, coded bursts of digital chatter, a language I couldn't understand but whose meaning was terrifyingly clear. They were communicating, coordinating, mapping every inch of my world. The forest was no longer a sanctuary. It had been converted into a tactical grid. The paranoia was a physical sickness. Every shadow seemed to hold a human shape. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered word. I was a prisoner in my own home, and the walls were closing in, meter by silent meter. The hardest part, the act that felt like a knife in my own heart, was breaking the ritual. That next Tuesday, as dusk fell, I stood on my porch, the bag of supplies heavy in my hand. But I couldn't move. I couldn't risk it. The two-note whistle never came, but I knew he was out there, waiting, trusting. To walk that path to the hollow cedar now would be an act of utter betrayal. I would be a Judas, leading them straight to him with a can of peaches and a loaf of bread. The thought was unbearable. I stayed inside, watching the darkness swallow the clearing, the weight of my broken promise pressing down on me. I was starving him of our connection, our only language, out of fear. A trade is a trade, and by failing to make my offering, I was violating the most sacred contract of my life. I was choosing my own fear over his trust, and the shame of it was a poison. The silence from the forest changed after that. It was no longer the attentive, companionable quiet of a friend listening from the shadows. It became a desperate, pleading silence, a silence full of questions I couldn't answer. For 2 weeks, the Tuesday ritual was broken. I'd wake up on Wednesday mornings with a profound sense of failure. On the 3rd week, I heard a sound that broke my heart. It wasn't the warning thump. It was a single, low, mournful call that echoed from the ravine just before dawn. It sounded like the two-note whistle, but it was distorted, broken, like a question that had been asked too many times without an answer. It was the sound of confusion and abandonment. He didn't understand. He thought I had left him. I was protecting his location, but I was destroying his trust, and I didn't know which was worse. I was caught in an impossible trap of my own making. Agent Thorne returned a week later. This time, she wasn't so polite. She got straight to the point. "Your routine has changed, Mr. Croft," she said, leaning against the rail of my porch as if she owned it. No more evening strolls down to the old cedar tree. She knew. They had watched it all. They had recorded our ritual for weeks, maybe months. She saw the flicker of panic in my eyes and pressed her advantage. "We're not unreasonable. We know there's a relationship, a pattern. All we want is to make formal contact. You can facilitate that. You can be the person who bridges the gap between worlds." She was offering me a role, a chance to be a part of history. But the price was his freedom. The price was betraying the one being on this earth that had ever truly seen me, that had mourned with me, that had saved my life. She was asking me to sell him out and dressing it up as a noble cause. Then she deployed her final, most cruel weapon. Her voice softened, taking on a tone of synthetic sympathy. "We've reviewed your family history, Silas. The file on your brother, Leo, a tragedy. To lose someone like that, without a trace, without answers, it leaves a hole that can never be filled." My hands clenched into fists, my knuckles white. She was using him. She was using my grief, my deepest, most sacred wound, as a tool for leverage. "This asset," she continued, her eyes locking onto mine, "was here in 1974. It was in this valley when that plane went down. It might be the only witness. It might be the only one who knows what really happened. Don't you want to know? Don't you deserve, after all these years, to finally know the truth?" It was a masterfully cruel move. She was offering me the one thing I had craved for nearly 50 years, an answer, in exchange for his capture. Her team's analysis had gone further than I could have imagined. "The symbols," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The star charts you've been so diligently documenting. We've seen them. Our analysts don't think they're territory markers. They believe it's a language, possibly a map, possibly a distress call. Mr. Croft, we don't think we found a new species of primate. We think we found a survivor, a living Rosetta Stone for a first contact scenario. This is bigger than you, bigger than this forest. This is about the future of our entire species." The truth of it slammed into me. They knew. They understood the significance of the star charts. They weren't just hunting a big animal. They were trying to capture an extraterrestrial intelligence. And they were willing to use my personal history, my grief for Leo, as the key to unlock his cage. The scale of my secret, and their ambition, was staggering. Her final words were an ultimatum, delivered with the flat finality of a closing door. "Our observation phase is over. Silas, we're moving to acquisition. We have a team ready. They are the best in the world. We can do this with your help, which will ensure the asset's safety, or we can do it without you, which could be unpredictable. We move in at dawn. Tomorrow. The choice is yours. Be on the right side of history." She turned and walked back to her sedan without waiting for a reply. The car door closed with a quiet, solid thud. Inevitability. That was the only word for it. An old man with a deer rifle and a fragile heart against the full, silent weight of the United States government and its technology. My time was up. The lie I had lived for 49 years was about to collapse, and I had one night to decide. One night to choose between my brother's memory and my friend's life. The greatest secret of the century was about to be revealed, and I was the only thing standing in the way. I didn't wait for dawn. Her ultimatum wasn't a choice, it was a countdown. As her car's taillights disappeared down the road, a desperate, frantic energy seized me. My legs, old and stiff, screamed in protest as I half ran, half stumbled down the familiar path toward the hollow cedar. Every shadow was an agent, every rustle of leaves a footstep. I was a gasping, panicked old man, my heart a wild drum against my ribs, driven by a singular, desperate need. I had to warn him. I had to break our pact one last time to save it. I burst into the clearing by the ancient tree, my flashlight beam cutting a frantic, bouncing path through the darkness. He was there, not in the hollow, but standing beside it, a dark, silent mountain of a being, waiting for me. He hadn't been abandoned. He had been expecting me. The woods were holding their breath, waiting for the final act to play out, and so was I, bathed in the silent, knowing gaze of my oldest friend. He didn't make a sound. There was no need. As the distant, faint crackle of radio static reached my ears, their approach, he acted with a calm, deliberate purpose that froze me in place. He slowly raised a long, powerful arm and placed his hand flat against the rock face beside the cedar, right on the most recent of his star charts. Then, he pointed a single, long finger up into the black, star-dusted sky, directly toward the constellation of Eridanus. Then, he brought that same finger down and pointed it squarely at his own broad chest. Then, finally, he pointed to the ground at his feet. A star chart. The sky. Himself. Here. It was a sentence delivered in 3 perfect, undeniable gestures. I am from there, and I am here. It was a final, clear confession of his origin, a gift of truth in our last moments before the world came crashing down. The woods hold their secrets, but in that moment, He laid his bear for me to see, just as the hunters closed in. Then, the true revelation came, the one that shattered my world completely. As the sounds of their approach grew louder, the snap of a twig, a muffled cough, he turned his head towards the noise, listening, and he began to mimic it. First, a perfect, tinny replica of the crackle and hiss of their shortwave radios. It was uncanny, a piece of human technology recreated by a non-human throat. And then came the voice. He perfectly mimicked a human voice, faint, distorted by static, but utterly, terrifyingly familiar. Mayday. Mayday. This is November 734 Charlie. Engine failure. I'm losing altitude. Going down in the valley. It was Leo. It was my brother's voice, from his cockpit recorder, from the final moments of his life. The sound I had spent 49 years straining to imagine, the sound of his last breath, was being played back to me now by the only one who had heard it. My knees gave out. I sank to the ground, the flashlight dropping from my hand, its beam pointing uselessly at the sky. He had been there. He hadn't just found the compass. He had been drawn by the crash. He was the sole witness, a living, breathing black box, carrying my brother's last words in his memory for nearly 5 decades. The creature then made another series of sounds, the high-pitched whine of the engine, the sickening crunch of metal against rock, and then a profound, final silence. He had just told me the entire story without a single word of his own. He was the guardian of Leo's final moments, the keeper of his ghost. And I understood why the wreckage was never found. Because he was there. His presence had kept the search parties, the planes, everyone away. He had protected the site of my brother's grave, turning it into a sanctuary only he could enter. The clearing was suddenly flooded with the cold, sterile beams of a dozen tactical flashlights, pinning us in a cage of white light. Thorne stepped forward from behind a shield of heavily armed men, her own rifle held at a low, ready position. Her voice cut through the air, devoid of all warmth. "It's over, Silas. Give it to us." Her eyes were not on me, but on the colossal figure standing over me. The look on her face was not one of fear or wonder. It was the look of a collector who has finally found the rarest specimen on Earth. I saw the future in her eyes, the concrete room, the sterile tables, the needles, and the saws. They would break him down into pieces of data, destroying the very thing they sought to understand. The secret was out, and the monster, the real monster, was the one with the badges and the rifles. I looked from Thorne's cold, determined face to the creature. He hadn't moved. He stood over me, a silent guardian, his dark eyes reflecting the harsh beams of their lights. He was not a monster. He was a mourner, a refugee, a historian, and he was my friend. Thorne was offering me a deal with the devil. Give him up, and maybe, just maybe, they'd share what else he knew about Leo's final moments. It was the temptation she had dangled in front of me all along, the promise of closure. But what was closure worth if it was bought with the most profound betrayal of my life? A trade is a trade. He had given me a piece of my brother's memory. I owed him his freedom. I had failed my brother in life, but I would not fail the one who had unknowingly guarded his final resting place for half a century. With a surge of strength I didn't know I had, I scrambled to my feet and stood between them, my arms outstretched. My voice, when it came, was a raw, desperate bark. I pointed east, away from where he stood, towards the collapsed shafts of the old borax mine on the far side of the mountain. "He's in there," I lied, pouring every last ounce of conviction I had into the words. "He uses the tunnels, a labyrinth. You'll never get him out of there. He'll bring the whole mountain down on you. He's dangerous. You hear me? A killer." I was creating a phantom, a monster for them to chase, a story to send them on a wild goose chase into the most dangerous, unstable part of this land. It was a desperate, flimsy lie, but all I needed was time. Just a few moments for him to melt back into the one place they could never truly conquer. The deep, dark woods behind me. As 2 agents grabbed my arms, twisting them behind my back with brutal efficiency, the creature vanished. There was no sound, no crash through the undergrowth. He simply receded into the darkness, a shadow dissolving back into the night. It was done. The cold steel of handcuffs clicked around my wrists. As they pulled me away, Thorne stepped close. Her face inches from mine, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for me. "That was a good story, Silas. But we know." She paused, letting the words hang in the cold air before delivering the final, brutal twist of the knife. "That compass we recovered from your porch. Military issue. Serial number tracks back to a Cessna 150 that went missing in this sector in 1974. We've always suspected there was a connection. We were just waiting for you to lead us to the source." They knew. They had been using my grief all along. I'm gone now. I don't know where they're taking me. But as I sit in the back of this cold, sterile van, I know he is free. My lie, my arrest, it bought his escape. My final, most important trade. And the moral of my long, silent life is this: we are a species that cages what it cannot control, that dissects what it does not understand. I spent half my life hiding a monster, only to discover the real monster was the one with the satellites and the algorithms, the one that sees everything sacred as an unconventional asset to be collected and cataloged. They saw a specimen. I saw a soul. I failed my brother in life. I couldn't save him from the sky. But I did not fail the one who guarded his memory on the ground. Some truths are not ours to tell. They belong to the mountain. My story will die with me in whatever concrete box they put me in. But the lie I told Thorne, I hope it takes root. I hope the story of the monster in the borax mine becomes the new local legend, another layer of fiction to protect the truth. Maybe, somewhere out there, he's still watching the sky, marking the rocks, a lonely cartographer waiting for a ship that will never come. Maybe he's finally at peace. Or maybe he's just waiting for the next person who is quiet enough to listen to the forest's secrets. I've given you my confession. It's all I have left. Please, don't let it be for nothing. If you believe my story, if you believe in secrets worth keeping, then please, like this recording, subscribe for more stories from the edge of the map, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. And please, stick around for the next story. There are more voices out there in the dark, waiting to be heard.